You're sitting in the dentist chair. There's a light overhead bright enough to blur the ceiling, a suction tube in your mouth, a paper bib across your chest, and somewhere behind that surgical mask is a person who went to school for 8 years specifically to not hurt you. You know all of this, and you're still scared. Now imagine that same fear, that same pressure building in your jaw, that same anticipation of the drill, but it's 59,000 years ago. The cave smells like animal fat and wood smoke. There's no chair, there's no light. The tool pressing into your tooth is a sliver of jasper, thin enough to be twirled between two fingers. And the person holding it is someone who has watched you suffer for days and decided that doing something, anything, is better than watching you suffer for more. They are going to drill into your tooth without anesthesia, and you are going to let them. In May 2026, researchers publishing in PLOS ONE described a 59,000-year-old Neanderthal molar discovered in Chagorskaya Cave in the Altai Mountains of western Siberia. The tooth had a deep cavity. The hole drilled into it reached all the way to the pulp chamber near the roots. Under a scanning electron microscope, the interior walls showed parallel linear grooves, radial scratches consistent with rotation, the unmistakable signature of a stone tool being twisted manually into living enamel. The research team replicated the procedure on modern human teeth using jasper points found at the same cave. The marks matched. And here is the detail that makes this real. The edges of the cavity were polished, worn smooth by subsequent chewing. This patient did not die on the table. They survived, and then they kept eating. The oldest evidence of dentistry in human history, and it hurt. There is no version of this that did not hurt. Before there were hospitals, before there were pharmacies, before there was even a word for medicine, humans were doing things to each other's bodies that required an enormous act of trust. The person receiving the treatment had to believe, on some level, that the pain coming was less than the pain already there, and the person performing it had to care enough to try. That is where medicine actually starts, not in a laboratory, in a decision. But the drilled tooth was not the most extreme thing they attempted, not even close. At some point in the deep past, the oldest confirmed examples date to around 7,000 BCE, though some sites suggest earlier someone looked at a person suffering from severe headaches, from seizures, from what we would now call traumatic brain injury, and concluded that the problem was inside the skull, and that opening the skull might fix it. The procedure is called trepanation. A hole cut deliberately through the bone of the cranium using stone tools in a patient who was awake for at least part of it. Evidence of trepanation has been found on every inhabited continent. Skulls with cut and scraped openings have been excavated in Peru, France, Russia, China, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Many of these skulls show bone regrowth around the edges of the wound, which means the patient lived long enough afterward for healing to begin. Studies of Neolithic trepanation specimens suggest survival rates somewhere between 50 and 90%, depending on the region and the era. For a surgical procedure performed with stone tools and no sterile technique, that number is hard to explain. What explains it, in part, is what the Inca of Peru already understood. A 2013 study documented that Incan surgeons performing trepanation had their patients chew coca leaves, then spit the pulped leaves directly into the open wound. Coca leaves, from which cocaine is derived, produce a localized numbing effect when applied to tissue. The Inca were not using anesthesia in the modern sense. They were using the best available pharmacology in a 4,000-year-old surgical tradition that they had refined through generations of watching what worked and what killed people. Some of their predecessors had nothing. Earlier populations in Europe and the Near East performed the same operation in an era before anyone had identified a plant that numbed pain on contact. They had willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, what your body converts into aspirin and poplar bark, which Neanderthal dental calculus from El Sidrón Cave in Spain confirms was being consumed at least 50,000 years ago, likely as a painkiller. But even these compounds at their natural concentrations would not have made drilling through a skull painless. They would have taken the edge off, maybe. The rest was endurance, theirs and the healers. And then there is the thing that almost no documentary about ancient medicine ever covers, the event that was, statistically, the most medically dangerous thing that happened in a hunter-gatherer camp. More dangerous than hunting, more dangerous than infection. Childbirth. The human pelvis, shaped by millions of years of selection for bipedal walking, is barely wide enough to accommodate the skull of a full-term infant. Before cesarean sections existed, before blood transfusions, before antibiotics for the sepsis that follows a prolonged, difficult delivery, women in labor were navigating the most dangerous biological event of their lives with whatever the camp's healer knew how to do. At El Cerro de las Viñas in Murcia, Spain, researchers identified the skeletal remains of a woman whose position at death, fetus still in the birth canal, indicated she died of obstructed labor. This burial dates to roughly 3,000 years ago. The biology is older than recorded time, and it killed women long before anyone thought to write it down. The person who stood beside her, doing whatever could be done, was the healer. In 2021, researchers publishing in PLOS ONE analyzed a burial site from the Natufian culture in the eastern Mediterranean, dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. One grave stood out from all the others. A woman in her 40s, buried with the remains of more than 50 tortoise shells, portions of an eagle, a leopard, a wild boar, and the foot of a human being. The researchers concluded she was almost certainly a healer, possibly a shaman. She was the most carefully interred individual at the entire site. Her community buried her with more care than they buried anyone else, because losing her meant losing something that could not be replaced. A shaman was a specialist who had spent a lifetime accumulating knowledge that existed nowhere else in the community: which plants reduced fever, which compounds cleaned wounds, how to position a woman in obstructed labor when a skull fracture required intervention and when it did not. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in one person's memory, refined through practice, passed forward through apprenticeship when there was time and a student willing to learn. When the shaman died suddenly of the same fever she had spent her life treating, the knowledge died with her. Every compound she had identified, every dosage calibrated through decades of watching people survive and not survive, gone. A 2022 report in Science described Uldarico Matapi Yucuna, last shaman of the Matapi people of the Colombian Amazon. He told researchers that the knowledge of his tradition cannot translate into other languages. He has spent 30 years in Bogotá trying to write it down, knowing that translation loses something only practice can preserve. The same extinction that struck ancient camps over and over is still happening now. The researchers who documented his situation wrote that humanity is losing traditional medical knowledge at a faster rate than it is losing the plants that knowledge describes. The archive is still burning. What ancient humans understood, though what took modern medicine an embarrassingly long time to accept, was that some of the body's responses to illness were not problems to be corrected. Fever is the clearest example. For decades in the 20th century, standard medical practice was to suppress fever aggressively, ice baths, antipyretics, at the first sign of a rise in temperature. It turns out this was often wrong. Fever is an immune system behavior. The body raises its core temperature specifically because many bacterial and viral pathogens cannot replicate efficiently above a certain threshold. You are cooking them. The discomfort is a side effect of a process that is working. Ethnographic studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer populations document a consistent pattern. When a member of the group develops a fever, they are moved closer to the fire and kept warm. The logic, in pre-scientific terms, was that the sickness wanted cold and the body wanted heat, so you gave the body what it wanted. The underlying immunology was not understood. But the outcome was right. 300,000 years of infectious disease had selected for the behavior before anyone had a word for the immune system. This is the part that gets inside you, if you think about it long enough. They did not have germ theory. They had no microscopes, no clinical trials, no peer-reviewed journals. What they had was each other, and enough time watching each other get sick and either recover or die to build a rough working model of what helped. Most attempts failed. The failures were not recorded anywhere. The successes were passed forward, repeated, refined, tested again in the next illness and the one after that. Think about the dentist chair one more time. You sit in it, and you are afraid, and you know you are afraid of something that will last 40 minutes and leave you with a prescription and a follow-up appointment in 6 months. The person in Chegirskaya cave sat in the dark with a sliver of jasper coming toward them, and the only thing standing between that moment and complete terror was the fact that someone they trusted was holding the tool. Someone who had done this before, or had watched someone do it before, and believed it would help. That trust is the oldest medical institution on Earth. It predates every hospital, it predates every pharmaceutical company, it predates the word medicine by tens of thousands of years. Then consider Tina. In June 2024, researchers publishing in Science Advances reported on a fossilized fragment of temporal bone excavated in 1989 from Cova Negra, a cave in eastern Spain. The bone belonged to a child. The malformations in the inner ear anatomy, abnormalities in the semicircular canals that govern balance, reduction in the size of the cochlea, structural irregularities consistent with a specific pattern pointed to Down syndrome. The Neanderthal child, the researchers nicknamed Tina, was the first known case of the condition in any non-modern human species. She lived at Cova Negra somewhere between 273,000 and 146,000 years ago. She lived to at least 6 years old. She had hearing loss. She likely had vertigo severe enough to affect her ability to walk. She may have had trouble nursing as an infant. She could not have survived 6 years without sustained, intentional care from members of her group who received nothing practical in return. The researchers framed this carefully. Prior evidence of Neanderthal caregiving had always involved adults, individuals who might one day recover and contribute to the group again. Tina could not have been cared for under any calculation of mutual benefit. She was a child who would never be able to repay the resources spent keeping her alive, and yet someone fed her. Someone held her when the vertigo got bad. Someone learned how to help her nurse in those first weeks when it didn't work the way it was supposed to. There is a word for this that does not require scientific language. Medicine did not begin when someone identified the right compound in the right plant. It began before that, in the same moment that the species decided that a suffering member of the group was worth staying near. The drilled tooth in the Altai Mountains, the open skull in Neolithic France, the woman in Mercia who did not survive what her healer could not fix, the shaman buried with 50 tortoise shells in the eastern Mediterranean, the child with the damaged ears in a Spanish cave, kept alive by people who had no reason to do it other than the fact that she was there and she needed help. We have been making that decision for a very long time, long before we understood what we were doing, long before we had the language to explain why. Every healed bone in the archaeological record is someone who chose to remain.